Napoleon was an extremely ambitious man that wanted to change the entire fate of Europe and the world. He did so in the sense that Europe after his loss was forever changed. But if he wanted to achieve his goals and establish an entirely new European order, he would have had to have been a different man. Like with so many people in history, his hubris and ambition were his downfall, and realistically, being the man he was, he could never have achieved his goals and truly won. Napoleon certainly changed Europe and was an incredible general, but he didn't have realistic goals, and wasn't quite as good as diplomacy as he was at waging war. In this scenario, Napoleon is a different man. He manages his ambitions, is an extremely skilled diplomat, and just makes the right calls at exactly the right times with our amazing power of hindsight. He doesn't develop stomach cancer either, as him living a longer life is important if we don't want everything to come crumbling down when his 11-year-old successor has to take the reins. Even with this, a complete French victory is not the most realistic thing in the world, but nevertheless, that's the scenario we're going to explore in this video. As any history nerd has probably heard 1,000 times, one of, if not the biggest blunder during the Napoleonic Wars was Napoleon's invasion of Russia. With how massive and determined Russia was, it simply wasn't possible for Napoleon to militarily subjugate it. So in this scenario, Napoleon does not invade Russia in 1812 and avoids the disastrous campaign that cost him hundreds of thousands of men and weakened his army. He instead focuses on consolidating his control over Europe and maintaining good relations with his subjects and allies. Napoleon possibly could have done this by governing differently. Napoleon's rule was in many regions resented by the local population because of their heavy taxation, conscription, censorship, and interference in their affairs by what was seen as an outside power. Napoleon could have granted more autonomy and representation to the people across his European sphere and been less authoritarian. Not appoint his family members as kings in foreign lands, but support local rulers that share Napoleon's vision for Europe. In a sense, he could have promoted the ideals of the French Revolution more in order to win over the hearts and minds of Europeans. Napoleon was extremely popular in France and the real world. In this scenario, he gained similar popularity across Europe. These many changes together are what make this scenario, not just one event. It's possible Spain, with a local ruler, doesn't end up as rebellious, and without a disastrous invasion of Russia, the Sixth Coalition would either be much smaller or not even happen at all, as Prussia and Austria aren't emboldened enough to switch sides, and Spain is still a French ally. Napoleon deals with Russia leaving the continental system diplomatically. Perhaps they're entirely excluded from the European trade bloc France sought to build, or perhaps Napoleon retaliates in some other way, just not with a full-on invasion and attempt to take Moscow. Regardless of exactly how, Napoleon finds some compromise that keeps his subject in check and Russia from directly opposing Napoleon's Europe. With this leverage, Napoleon signs a favorable lasting peace deal, and Europe is reshaped. This alternate, less authoritarian continental system and eventual United States of Europe would be glued together by France and a series of strong, but not too powerful allies. The Ottoman Empire would become an ally of convenience. Napoleon's goals in the Middle East were simply not feasible if he also wanted a European empire, so he develops close diplomatic ties with Turkey to deter Russia. How long this new European order would last is obviously complete speculation, but in this scenario I imagine it lasts the better part of the 1800s, till the first domino falls and another major war makes it all come crashing down, not too dissimilar to the century-long relative peace following the Napoleonic Wars in the real world. Napoleon doesn't die from what was likely stomach cancer, and has time to prepare for what replaces him when he dies. Napoleon's long-term dream for Europe was to establish a united Europe made up of states freely formed based on nationalities, and he would likely attempt to achieve this. Some may argue he might not have held those ideals as close to heart as he pretended to, given his pretty authoritarian actions during the war, but in this scenario he does. The Austrian Empire would be one of the biggest hurdles given its multi-ethnic makeup. One possible, and obviously entirely speculative solution, would be to split Germany into a majority Low German and Protestant, as well as a majority High German and Catholic half, each governed from Berlin and Vienna. A powerful united Germany is avoided without ignoring German nationalism and entirely compromising Napoleon's dream. Austria would be compensated for its non-German losses, and Prussia would become a powerful member of the new European collective. A strong Poland in the east would function as a buffer state between Europe and Russia, and then eventually unified Scandinavia could also serve a similar purpose. An Italian state is formed, but its borders remain fairly conservative, and France itself keeps extremely favorable borders in order for it to remain the Union's strongest member. This all forms a sort of early European Union, with France at the spearhead. But of course, like any empire, it wouldn't last forever. But with massive empires all surrounding the French-led European order, there would be a constant external threat should these powers ever come together all at the same time. A lot also depends on what replaces Napoleon. Napoleon in the real world was a complicated character. He did spread many of the ideas of the French Revolution like liberty and equality, creating an efficient government and a legal framework which inspired our modern ones. But at the same time, he centralized power around himself and wanted to establish a dynasty. In this scenario, Napoleon is more of an idealist, true to the French Revolution's beliefs, but still retains this duality to an extent. The French legislators during Napoleon's rule had very limited powers in the real world and were more advisory, but in this scenario, after the war, Napoleon concedes a lot of power. The system that replaces him would be somewhere in between an absolutist monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. The legislative bodies are not just rubber stamp solutions, they can pass laws and have real power, but inspired by the Roman Republic of old, as well as the success of Napoleon's central rule, the emperor would be able to step in times of crisis, gaining extensive executive powers. In this world, the Napoleonic Wars would be remembered as the First Great War, and I imagine the Second Great War might take shape as soon as the Ottoman Empire no longer sees its alliance with French-led Europe as beneficial. While Turkey would certainly be at odds with Russia, in the long term it might be even more so with Europe because of their border in the Balkans. A major goal of the European collective would be to liberate the Christians within the Ottoman Empire and incorporate them into the European collective, and this would put them at odds. A dispute over Moldova, Wallachia, Croatia, or Serbian or Greek rebels could easily sour relations between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, starting a major war. In this scenario, war breaks out in the 1890s as rebels across the Balkans are carving new countries out of the Ottoman Empire. Serbia seeks to join the European collective as part of a larger Yugoslav nation, and in this process, tensions escalate and war between France and the Ottoman Empire breaks out. The British-Russian alliance quickly capitalizes on this opportunity and declares war on France in order to challenge the European collective. This very quickly turns into a complicated war. Tensions that had been brewing internally, like North German claims to parts of Poland and Scandinavia, Hungarian claims to their old empire, and Italian goals of a border along the Alps suddenly spill over as they see a weakening of France and another major European war as an opportunity to achieve their irredentist goals. While this is way earlier than our world's First World War, this conflict would still be seen as a major turning point for warfare. Our world didn't have a major European war during this time period, but conflicts such as the Second Schleswig War, Franco-Prussian War, as well as the American Civil War clearly indicated war was changing. Innovations such as rifled muskets, breech loaders, repeaters, and Minié balls had made Napoleonic tactics obsolete, so the winners here would highly depend on who adapts best to these innovations. During this period, France was on the decline, in part due to their demographic stagnation, but also to an extent because they underestimated their rivals such as Prussia. A somewhat similar situation might develop in this scenario, and with the European collective crumbling, not all supposed French allies would come to their aid. Some, like militarily weak South Germany and Scandinavia, would want to sign a quick peace. Spain wouldn't be interested in the war at all as it had little to gain, while only France's closest allies of Poland and newly formed Yugoslavia would show any real interest in maintaining French dominance on the continent. By the end of the century, the conflict would end with a French loss and a complete reshaping of European borders and balance of powers. While France would lose in the west, in the east it would be a more complicated story. The Russian Empire in the 1890s struggled with many of the same issues as in our world's 1910s, and was largely a backward society relative to that of the rest of Europe. So a costly war with a highly developed France, Poland, and Scandinavia, along with the death of Tsar Alexander III and the later loss in the Russo-Japanese War, would still lay the groundwork for a revolution in Russia, perhaps even earlier. The Ottoman Empire was also already on the decline, and several new states would be carved out of the Balkans. Following the war, the French would feel humiliated, having fallen from their position of Europe's spearhead, and during the almost century-long French rule, now North German and Italian lands would have had a substantial French population. This would fuel French irredentism. The French people and people across Europe would more generally also be desperate for change. This would all create the perfect circumstance for Karl Marx's ideas to gain much more traction earlier in history, especially in France. In the early 1900s, under France's new parliamentary government, established after the Second Great War, the French Communist Party would come to power and begin implementing socialist policies. Ideologically, French communists did differ somewhat from Russian communists, and it's not a given figures similar to Lenin would turn France into a one-party state like the Soviet Union. In this scenario, the Democratic branch wins out, with the communists nationalizing industry and abolishing the Napoleonic monarchy, but still permitting other political parties, free elections, and free press. So essentially democratic socialism. Everything is similar to a liberal democracy, the state just runs the entire economy. In Russia, the turn towards communism happens more like in our timeline, through revolution. Given that it happens earlier, there would be different political leaders, but I imagine the Bolsheviks or communists with a similar ideology still come to power, as Russia has historically always had a tendency towards authoritarianism, even if it isn't some universal rule. Similar revolutions occur across Europe with Russian support, and in other countries, communist parties are elected into power much like in France. Slowly new spheres of influence form, with both France and Russia rapidly industrializing, spreading their ideologies, with places like Germany and Britain at odds with French and Russian ambitions, seeing a shift towards the right, although not quite as drastic a shift as in Germany after our First World War, given they were on the winning sides of the previous Great War. This would essentially be the beginning of an early Cold War, although given that nuclear weapons had not yet been invented, it would eventually lead to a direct conflict, possibly sometime in the 1930s over disputes with Germany, which sat right in between French and Soviet spheres of influence. As the United States was going through the Great Depression and in a period of isolationism, Britain, Germany, and their allies would stand alone in Europe, leaving them vulnerable to a resurgent France and the waking giant that is the Soviet Union. It would by far be the bloodiest conflict in history, with technology only being slightly behind that of our Second World War. The Communist bloc, with France's advanced military and Russia's massive land forces, would eventually win the war, leaving Central Europe a devastated mess split between French and Russian influence. And this would be the true start of this world's Cold War, which would be quite different from our world's. There would be two main communist ideologies, with France and Russia being on cordial terms, but still competing rivals given their differing views on democracy's relationship with communism. The Soviet Union would establish a system much like in our world, the US and Britain would form a NATO-esque alliance, and France would establish an EU-esque loose federation in Western Europe inspired by Napoleon's European collective, which had created more of a common European identity very early on. Relations between the French-led communist world mainly centered around Western Europe, and the remaining free market capitalist countries would through the 1900s also improve as the Russian threat grows. It would essentially be a multipolar world, with two world-spanning American and Russian spheres of influence, and one significant regional power in Western Europe, sitting somewhere in between the two ideologically. They would compete in many of the same ways we saw in our real world. Nuclear weapons would be invented eventually. There would be a three-way space race, which probably takes us further than in the real world, especially given that France's European collective would be way more successful economically than the Soviet Union, which had to force itself through industrialization in a matter of decades. By the 80s and 90s, I see the Soviet Union and Russian sphere of influence, strict authoritarian model struggle to survive collapsing birth rates, a struggling economy, and a more interconnected world. We might have a three-way multipolar world with the US, European collective, and China being the main players. But that's about all for now. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and thank you to all my channel members. See you next time.